Okay, so four major uprisings occurred in 19th century. The first one was Gabriel Prosper's Rebellion, which occurred in 1800. It was a slave revolt that failed when Gabriel Prosper, a slave preacher and blacksmith, organized 1,000 slaves for an attack on Richmond, Virginia. A thunderstorm upset the timing of the attack, and a slave informer alerted the whites. Prosper and 25 of his followers were executed. The most carefully planned slave revolt was known as Denmark Vesey's Conspiracy. It was named after its leader, a free black in Charleston. The rebels planned to seize control of Charleston in 1822 and escape to freedom in Haiti, a free black republic, but they were betrayed by other slaves and 75 conspirators were executed. Nat Turner's rebellion was the most impacting and effective slave rebellion in that it led to a great amount of deaths in whites. It was uprisings of slaves in Southampton County, Virginia in the summer of 1831, led by Nat Turner, that resulted in the death of 55 whites. However, white people were more numerous and had all the guns. Slaves were only made up of only one-third of the population of the American South. It lacked the numbers to overwhelm the white population and could not escape to mountain highways or large tracts of jungle. Few runaways made it to Canada or to a free state. White people stopped black people and demanded to see papers and document their freedom or right to travel without a master. Anti-slavery groups in the Upper South and the North decided to tackle slavery by creating what was known as the Underground Railroad. This support system, set up by anti-slavery groups, was a secret network of stations and safe houses that assisted fugitive slaves in escaping the South. Okay, so out of more than 3 million slaves in the 1850s, only about 1,000 a year permanently escaped. Most runaways voluntarily returned or were tracked down by bloodhounds within a week. Slaves who ran away usually did so to visit a spouse or a loved one. Runaways could bargain for lenient treatment in return for faithful service in the future, and most were severely punished. Slaves resisted complete domination by their masters in less overt ways. They mocked white people in folk tales. Slave owners routinely complained of slaves malingering, which meant pretending to be ill at work, abusing farm animals, losing tools, stealing food, and committing arson. These subversive acts of protest helped slaves to maintain a sense of dignity and self-respect. And in these pictures, you can see a slave escaping and how the whites, well, the masters, treated their slaves. So the slaveholding majority consisted of large planters, and these planters expected their wives to help supervise the slaves and run the plantation. Women played a big part in the slaveholding minority. For example, when a master was called off on a business or political trip, the wife kept the plantation accounts. This shows how the wife worked harder than the husband. This played a huge impact on women because they actually enjoyed wealth and status, unlike most Southern women. Small slaveholders had little economic security compared to large slaveholders. A deadly outbreak of disease among their slaves or a single bad crop could destroy their credit and force them to sell their slaves to clear their debt. In contrast, the white majority consisted of yeoman farmers. They worked on the land with family labor, and these farmers were quick to move, and once settled in an area, they formed intensely localized societies in which fathers and husbands held sway over their families. In these communities, networks of kin and friends provided labor services when needed. Yeoman farmers were different than planters in that they guarded their independence. They avoided debt and sought to limit a government authority. In doing so, they grew food crops and depended on their sons and, when needed, their wives and daughters to work the fields. Because of poor transportation raised the cost of manufactured goods, they continued to make their own clothes, shoes, soap, and other consumer items. Planters provided local markets for the surplus grain and livestock of non-slave holders, and for a small fee, access to grist mills and gins for grinding corn and cleaning cotton. The yeomen staffed the slave patrols and became overseers on their plantations. Both groups sought to protect property rights from outside interference and to maintain a system of racial control in which white liberties rested on black humiliation. Yeomen and planters clashed over economic issues. Large slaveholders needed better credit and marketing facilities, which called for banks and internal improvements. Non-slaving farmers opposed banks and state-funded economic projects. They viewed bankers as grasping outsiders who wanted to rob them of their economic independence and suspected that state involvement in the economy led only to higher taxes and increased public debt. Okay, so a few Southern black people, 6% of the total in 1860, were free persons of color. They constituted 3% of the free population in the South. So this shows segregation playing a big role in society during the 1800s. During this time, laws were passed by the states denying many rights of citizenship to free blacks before the Civil War. These laws were known as black codes. This picture shows South Carolina's black code applied only to persons of color, defined as including anyone with more than 1/8 Negro blood. Because all black people in the South were labeled as slaves, they had to carry freedom papers, official certificates of their freedom to show that they were free. They were denied of all their rights. They were shut out of the political process and could not testify against white people in court, and many occupations were closed to them due to their skin color. Every slave state forbade the entry of free black people, and there were rules and regulations that forced them to live as an inferior caste. White people were superior and black people were inferior. An example shows that a black person who bumped into a white person in the street would most likely be flogged during that time. Most black people worked as farm laborers or tenants. However, the best economic opportunities were in the cities, where some found factory jobs and positions in the skilled trades, since the South had a general shortage of skilled labor. Cities also offered black people enough social space to find their own churches and mutual aid associations. After 1840, urban African American churches became the center of black community life, and church Sunday schools and day schools provided black people practically their only access to education, which they were determined to pursue despite white opposition. In the 1850s, more calls were made for laws to banish or enslave free black people. For example, Arkansas passed such a law in 1859, and similar bills were proposed in Florida, Tennessee, Mississippi, and Missouri to put black people where they thought they belonged. The 1830s marked a turning point. After the shocks of Nat Turner's rebellion, white Southerners began to develop a defense of slavery. By the 1850s, in terms of religion, politicians, intellectuals, and evangelical ministers were arguing that slavery was a positive good, an institution ordained by God as the foundation of Southern prosperity. They believed it was mild and even a caring institution that benefited society. By the 1830s, ministers took the lead in combating abolitionist charges that slavery was a moral and religious abomination. Southern churches had always supported slavery, and this support grew when abolitionists started revolting against slavery. Southern evangelicals tried to prove this through selective reading. They found evidence to prove that slavery was right. They pointed out that slavery had been practiced throughout the Roman world at the time of Christ. They believed that slavery was a part of God's plan to Christianize an inferior race and teach his people how to produce raw materials that benefited the world's masses. The most common defense of slavery was the racial argument that black people were unfit for freedom. White people alleged that black people were naturally lazy and inherently inferior to white people. If they were freed, they would turn to crime and sexually assault white women. In conclusion, after 1830, the abolitionist movement in the North attacked slavery on moral grounds and demanded that it be abolished. On the other hand, religious and intellectual leaders in the South portrayed slavery as a Christian institution and a positive good necessary for white democracy and would cause peace between race relations. Slaves fought against slavery. They dreamed of freedom and sustained that dream through their own forms of Christianity and the support of family and kin. In spite of the economic benefits of slavery and the contribution slaves made to American prosperity, slaves paid a price that no one should ever have to pay. It had its consequences in that it caused a lot of tension with the North, and by the 1850s, many concluded that the only way to resolve their dilemma was to make the South a separate nation.